Okay. So welcome back. The second half of our class, I won't say second half, the final third of this class is going to focus on budget basics and allowable costs. So I'll jump right in so that we have some time for questions and discussion. So this section is we've called it budget basics, but as those of you who are in finance know, the budgets we deal with as research administrators are actually quite complex. They're subject to many rules and regulations. It's important to note that budgets proposed for grants are very highly scrutinized. These are a major factor in review and funding decisions, and they must be built or tailored specifically to the award notice. What you propose in a budget is the maximum you're likely to receive. So if you're funded, it's not likely that they'll come back and say, also, here's some more money for you. So it really needs to be accurate because it serves as the basis to your actual award. Additionally, all the different categories, and we'll talk about those in a minute for budgets, really should be accurate because changes to budgets that are significant can be quite complex and take a lot of time. And so ensuring your budget is correct up front is very important. So NIH budgets can really be split into two main divisions. So direct costs and indirect costs. Together, those create total costs. So the first of these, direct costs, represents anything that can be directly assigned to project activities. So typical categories here include personnel, so salaries and fringe, consultant costs, which are separated out from personnel in an NIH budget, travel, equipment, supplies and materials, subcontracts, and other expenses. So we'll talk about a few of these. So for personnel costs, what you propose in your application should match your institutional based salaries. You should have a way to back this up. If the NIH says, why are you proposing, $1 million for this person when their base salary is nowhere near that. And so you'll want to make sure that this matches institutional base salaries, that you're calculating any effort on a grant as a percent effort and not an hourly wage for personnel. Effort for any people, as we mentioned in other support, your effort across all your projects cannot exceed 100%. It also cannot exceed 100% in a calendar year. So on a grant budget that is separated by years, the effort in a single year cannot exceed 100%. Fringe rates must be documented by your institution. So if you're going to request fringe or benefits, they have to be something that's actually utilized at your institution. And then this final one, so salary increases. So the NIH has said that they won't necessarily honor salary increases in subsequent years of a grant. So if you propose a salary for a person in year one, and then you increase it by 2 or 3% in the out years, they may or may not award that. And we see it very different results based on who we're applying to. So some NIH institutes just go ahead and allow it, and some have been very strict about not allowing it. So just be aware that that may not be honored. But if you do include them, it should be consistent with your institutional policy. For consultants, there's a daily maximum rate depending on what they're doing. And so the funding agency can set this. So if they have one set, consultant costs cannot exceed this. You must have a written and fee-based agreement in place with a consultant once a grant is funded to really be considered a consultant. And so these costs are not supposed to be distributed until that's in place. And just make sure that you follow any institutional restrictions. If someone says, yes, I would love to be a consultant on your project, please make sure they have institutional permission to do so. Some institutions do not allow their investigators to be consultants on grants because it prevents them from getting the same indirect costs and things like that associated with a normal contract. For travel, this includes all of the categories you would expect. So airfare, mileage or ground transportation, per diem costs for lodging and meals, and conference registrations for individuals who are on the project if the conference supports or furthers the project objectives. And so there are certainly exceptions to this, but some of the, and we'll talk about it in a moment, but some of the funding opportunities will restrict travel or limit how much you can spend on this. But as long as it's reasonable, many grants allow it. Equipment includes any items that cost $5,000 or more, $5,000 US or more, and that's per item. And they must have a useful life of more than 1 year. So if they fit into that category, they are classified as equipment. And this is really important to separate these out from like supplies and materials, because it affects, as you'll see in a moment, how indirect costs are calculated. Tangible personal property or other property that does not meet those requirements. So if it's less than $5,000 or doesn't have a shelf or a useful life of a year, those go under supplies and materials instead. It's important to note that value added tax or VAT is allowed on NIH awards as a direct cost. Any supplies or materials can be itemized by subcategory. So laboratory supplies, office supplies, things like that. For subcontracts, this you can also hear them called subawards. This is a written agreement that gives a portion of the scope of work for the project to a different organization. It's required to have a written agreement in place to execute one of these. And so this should be any funding that you're going to give to another organization to help with their work or to help with the work for the project. And then finally, costs that don't fit into other categories. So participant incentives, communication costs, printing costs, those often fall under this final category of other expenses. And similar to supplies and materials, they do need to be categorized by subcategory. So participant incentives and things like that. So the other division of total costs, so you had direct costs, now we talk about indirect costs. You might also hear this referred to as overhead or facilities and administrative costs, F&A, IDCs, that all means the same thing. And so this is work, these are costs that are necessary to support a sponsored project, but they might be shared across a number of projects, so not so easy to quantify per project. So examples might include administrative support or office space. So these are calculated for a grant as a percentage based on the direct costs and the approved indirect cost rate. For US institutions, it's called a Negotiated Indirect Cost Rate Agreement, NICRA, N-I-C-R-A, and this varies widely. So institutions negotiate this through the government, and it's very different for different organizations in different states across the US. And we have to be able to provide proof of our NICRA when we submit a grant. The funding agency sometimes puts a cap on the indirect costs for funding announcements. And part of that is to avoid the really large total cost budgets. And so for foreign institutions, the NIH currently has a standard IDC rate of 8%. There is rumor that they may increase that in the future, and we would really like to see that. I know that 8% is very low. When calculating IDCs for a budget, you use the direct costs minus items in any of the areas that you see here. So equipment, tuition, research patient care costs, and rent. You cannot collect indirect costs on those items. And then this part can be confusing. So the first time you set up a budget, if you haven't included one that has a subaward or a subcontract before. So the organization receiving the subcontract is called the subrecipient. So they charge their full direct and their indirect rates for any of their activities. But the person issuing the subcontract, the prime organization who received the original award, they can only collect indirects on the first $25,000 of that subaward. I'm going to try my best to clarify that with a quick example. So you can see here that the institution is charging percent effort for a faculty member and a staff member. And remember that all of the budgets that you create are based on annual costs, unless the funding opportunity says otherwise. So when you calculate effort or something that recurs monthly, you should still include them as a total for the year. So we have effort for a professor and a staff member, funding for them to go to a conference and travel to the field site for this project, this imaginary project. Communication and printing costs, you can see, come under other expenses. And then you can see this subaward. And so the subaward total is over $25,000. So when you calculate the indirect here, and you're calculating 8% times your direct cost, you're only including the 25,000 of this and not the other $4,150. So this is an example. You'll have it in your slides so you can go back and look at it. But so this is how these costs are usually calculated. So the very first step when you build a budget should be to review that funding opportunity announcement. You have to understand the restrictions from the sponsor. Hillary went through with you how to really look at a funding opportunity announcement, but you really want to make sure that you pick out all of the components that are related to finance. You may have heard the term, or you may see the term as you go through them, modular budget. This is a simpler version of a budget. It's allowed for certain smaller and simpler funding opportunities. Foreign institutions are generally not allowed to submit a modular budget. They're always required to submit a detailed budget. And so we're not going to cover the modular versions very much in this class. When reviewing a funding opportunity, pay specific attention to a few things. So you want to pay attention to the dollar limit per year and understand whether that limit is based on direct costs or total costs. So if they say your direct costs can only be $250,000 a year, that's different than if they say your total cost can only be $250,000 a year, which would include direct and indirect. And that can make a huge difference in what you can propose in the scope of work that you have. Make sure you read the FOA, the funding opportunity announcement, carefully to also understand any other restrictions or limitations they have. So some of them specify that funds cannot be used for tuition or travel or certain types of effort. And so it's really important to know what you can and cannot use the money for. Look, especially if you're working on supporting career development awards, as those have very different restrictions than, like, say, a typical research award would have. Also, if you're doing a very large budget, especially a big multi-institutional budget, prior approval may be needed from the NIH to submit applications, and that can take some time. So sometimes prior approval is required months in advance. So figure out early if your application will exceed a certain threshold. For typical grants, that's $500,000 a year. And so if you have a grant that's going to fall into that category, you need to reach out to the NIH early to get that permission in place. If you're working with US partner institutions, I would advise making sure that you know their indirect cost rates before you begin. If the funding opportunity is capped as total costs instead of direct costs, this can be very prohibitive in bringing in multiple US partners, because sometimes the institutional indirect costs are very high. In some cases, they greatly exceed 50%. And so this can really limit the budget and what can be accomplished. When building a budget, all of the costs should be calculated in US dollars for NIH applications. And again, that should be calculated at the time of submission. So understanding that some inflation and changes may happen. So it's important to note that your budget is getting reviewed by at least two types of people. So the first are the scientific reviewers. They look at the budget and they assess whether it's appropriate for the work that's being proposed. So if your investigators significantly over or underestimate what it takes, this might cause the reviewer to believe that the investigators don't actually know what they're doing. So they might not think that you understand what it takes to do the research. So if it's very overinflated, they may also suggest reductions to either the budget amount or the award period. And the NIH program staff typically do follow reviewers' recommendations, or at least take them very seriously. So it's important to make sure that what you propose is accurate. The budget is then reviewed by NIH staff. So if it passes the review, it still gets checked again by NIH staff before it gets funded. And remember that you're providing a detailed budget with all of these cost items. So if the NIH determines that any of the items that you've included in your budget are unallowable or inappropriate, they're likely to just deduct them from your total. They may not give you a chance to replace them with something else. And so this would just reduce your overall budget. So now where you already had not quite enough funds to do the work, now you have even less. So it's really important to make sure that this is accurate up front. And also budgets are sometimes administratively reduced by NIH for totally unrelated reasons. It may have nothing to do with your budget. You might have submitted a perfectly compliant budget that's really accurate for the work that's being done. And NIH funding is just limited. And so they propose a shorter award period or just less funds. And so I know how important it is for everyone to be able to secure every dollar needed for a project. So make sure you follow the guidelines, and that will give you the best shot there. So I'd love to hear from you, and I'm going to turn off the recording real quick. Hang on.